IVM.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum.
When someone says something that
with
really
CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just
and
100
so
rupees.
Walter kind of
On
took
top
this
of
one
that,
step
there are
further
zero
and
charges for
realized,
deposits and withdrawals,
so
you can trade, buy, sell,
the
however and whenever you want. All of this, plus an extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM podcast.
Exactly the right place.
CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast. My guest today is Jon Lefkovitz, an independent filmmaker and teacher of cinema from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a very interesting story of how we both met on Twitter. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen me do a lot of fanboy posts on my absolute idol when it comes to filmmaking, which is Walter Murch. Now, if you know Walter, then you don't need me to introduce him to you. If you don't, then he is the greatest editor of cinema to have ever been born. Walter is the first guy to have ever been given the credit sound design, and his editing and sound work in films like The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, Conversations, THX 1138, and The English Patient are what film legends are made of. Walter had some of the greatest cinematic collaborations with creators like Coppola, Anthony Minghella, and George Lucas. So back to the story of how I met Jon on Twitter. I was being my usual fanboy self when I posted something about Walter, and then Jon happened to see the tweet, and then he mentioned that he was working on a film which was on Walter. Of course, I was extraordinarily excited. And then a few weeks back, I did manage to actually catch his brilliant tribute to Walter, this documentary film called Sight and Sound, The Cinema of Walter Murch. The film is available for free on Vimeo, and I have added that link to the show notes. So as you probably guessed, this episode is going to be a total tribute where two fanboys compare notes and gush over their mutual idol, by discussing, of course, his best moments in cinema. This is the Filter Coffee podcast, and we'll be right back after this very, very short break. Stay with us.
Do check out our new show, Tech Life at Intuit, hosted by Shiladitya Mukhopadhyay. Shiladitya talked to Ashu Verma, Vice President Director of Global Brand, and Manisha, Distinguished Engineer, Software Engineer at India. They talk about Intuit's employee-powered approach that has won them many accolades and tons more. Here's what they say about what someone joining a new workplace like Intuit should consider.
We are a 35-plus-year-old company.
We want
we have
people
software,
to come
and everybody
to
knows
Intuit,
that software
join
gets dated as
believe in what our mission is,
we have to
and be able to achieve that by doing the best work of their life, and also bringing their whole self to work.
One of the things
I
that
think
we
these have
realized about
become so profound
6-7 years ago
that I would say anyone who is looking at joining any company, not just Intuit, should definitely look at what's the mission of that company and how do I connect to that mission or the purpose that the company has, and what can I do to amplify it.
Catch new episodes of Tech Life at Intuit every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever else you get your podcast
website, or wherever else you get your podcast from.
Welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast, Jon. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
How does this podcast find you, and which part of the world are you in right now?
I am in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States.
Do you live in Pittsburgh?
I do.
Or do you live in
yes.
LA? Okay.
Yeah.
It's
moved here a few years ago from LA.
How is it being an independent filmmaker out of Pittsburgh? It's not really a festival-friendly town, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but we do have quite a few people who are involved in just independent filmmaking and a lot of film education here. I teach at two of the local colleges, and I also work at a nonprofit where I'm teaching high school students how to make movies.
Wow. Tell us a little bit more about that experience. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, no, I started veering into education back in Los Angeles towards the end of my time there. And, both of my parents are educators, and I love teaching. And so found that was just a much more rewarding way to to make a living while I was also trying to be an independent filmmaker than being a freelance editor. I'm still doing freelance editing, but in Los Angeles, it was not very spiritually fulfilling. Let's put it that way.
I think I know what you mean, but I'll never be sure. But what is the age of the students that you teach cinema to in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I teach high school and college level, university level.
So I think it's important to let the audience know how we met each other. And I think that's probably a good place to start the episode as well. Right. I think on Twitter, I was talking about Walter, and I think probably one of the books or one of the films. And then, you responded to it, and then we got talking. And then I got to know that you had made this wonderful film called Sight and Sound, the cinema of Walter Murch. And then I saw it. I fell in love with the film. It was the absolute fanboy tribute to Walter.
Thank you.
And that's how then we thought, we should totally record an episode on this, right?
Yeah.
I will later on in the episode talk to you about what Walter means to me and how he's one of my biggest inspirations when it comes to cinema. But this is about you. When did you first discover Walter and the cinema? What has been his impact on you? You're an independent filmmaker. So when did your Walter fandom start?
Yeah, so I'm 38 now. I discovered Walter maybe a little over 20 years ago at 15 or 16, because I started really becoming an intense teenage cinephile, around like 13. And just a few years in, I landed in the blink of an eye. I was just reading a bunch of different film books, and that one I found on some list or somewhere. I don't remember how, but I read it and I just was blown away, especially by Walter's theory about the human blink. I just thought that was so original and interesting and unusual. So I went from In the Blink of an Eye to The Conversations with Michael Ondaatje. And I was also a very huge fan of Coppola's 1970s work. And so Walter's contribution to all four of those films, is essential and really impactful. So I remember seeing The Conversation and then just thinking this has got to be one of my favorite movies ever. And since I've seen it, countless times, and I always see something new in it. And yeah, and so I never really forgot about him, like throughout all my years, just learning about film in college, then making movies, and then, just navigating the film industry in Los Angeles, and then teaching. And, Walter is very much, in addition to being a filmmaker, he's a teacher. And he is just so articulate and insightful. And you could just listen to him talk for hours and hours. Yeah. So, and also he's one of the only heroes that I've had who didn't turn out to be a bad person or just like a really super flawed person. He just is a genuinely like decent guy and is just kind and humble, but also like very confident and sure of himself because, he has the right to be. He's such a influential figure, for 50 years now. So, right. And I'm not the first to say that, and I'm not the first even to make a documentary about him, but I'm really glad that this movie has not only reached him, but also reached a lot of his fans like you.
Right.
And yeah, so that's pretty awesome.
You mentioned Walter's theory of the human blink. For the uninitiated, do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so it comes from an article that he read with the director John Huston, made Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And this was in the 70s. He was working on The Conversation, and Huston was talking about blinking. And the fact that, when you move your eyes, you are when you blink your eyes, you're processing thoughts. When someone says something that really affects you, you blink involuntarily. And so Walter kind of took this one step further and realized, the blink is very much a metaphor for the cut in editing. When we cut from one shot to another, we're going from one thought to another. And so editing is kind of just a way of a visual manifestation of human blinking. And also, when actors blink, you can really improve a performance by moving the shot to make them blink at exactly the right place. A really good actor is going to blink in the right places anyway, because they're so in the zone, they're so in the character that they'll just do it naturally. But if the performance is not so great, you can just make it better by making sure that they blink as soon as something is said in the conversation that changes gears or that's interesting to them, or that, that's going to have some kind of effect on them. So a lot to process there, but it's all pretty interesting.
It is. My introduction to Walter was mostly through Michael's book. We're talking about Michael Ondaatje, the Sri Lankan author, who also wrote the English Patient, who had a very long collaboration with Walter. And it is through that book that I then discovered multiple other works of Walter. And of course, this is a pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter sort of an era that I discovered Walter in. So it was not that easy to just Google his work. It's probably a pre-IMDb era, I think. So this is actually an era where you find an interesting film, then you go to Netflix, the website, which used to send you DVDs.
Right.
And if anyone remembers that time, and then you sort of get the DVDs home and then you sort of watch it. Right? Yep. And I remember, reading about the American Zoetrope, Coppola, the entire group, and then sort of rewatching Godfather again and a lot of other films. For me, like you rightly said, I think Conversations is one of the greatest sound experiences ever. And a couple of trivia points come to my mind. Was Walter the first guy to ever have the title sound design?
Yes. So he coined that title. And the story goes something like he wasn't in the union, and so he couldn't be credited as like whatever the official title was. So Coppola asked him, what do you want to be credited as? And he just said, how about sound designer? And so this has now become a phrase that is widely used, very common, in film. And he was the first one, sound designer.
Right.
Sound design.
That's amazing. And the other trivia that I remember after reading that book is, and I want to make sure I get this one right, there was a film, which is, I forget the name of the film. Is it THX 1138? That's a film, right? The one that he did with George Lucas, if I'm not wrong?
Right. He co-wrote it. And he did the sound design. Right.
And I think the way I remember it, I think the theater standard that we have, the theater sound standard, THX, was in a way had its origin on that film and the kind of sound that it had. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Lucas has been pretty innovative. He kind of was one of the first to really get into digital editing, nonlinear editing, with what was called the Edit Droid, and with THX, a really advanced sound system. But aside from THX, Walter, I don't think, was the one who invented the THX. I think it might have been someone whose initials actually were TH, but I'm not sure. But he, for Apocalypse Now, created the 5.1 stereo surround sound system, where you have speakers on in front of you, to the side, behind, and then below, having a subwoofer to increase that bass. And that was something that he innovated that we also use today very widely and very commonly.
Right. John, like I said in the introduction, this is likely to be a conversation between two fanboys of the same artist, comparing notes on him. So if you have to pick one, and I know it is difficult, but please do indulge me for the next few minutes. If you have to pick one as your favorite Walter moment in cinema, what would that be?
Well, I devoted a whole section to Blink, to the Blink theory. But the first thing that comes to mind is in the conversation, without spoiling too much for the listeners out there, there's a line that the characters say that is said with a different inflection, a different emphasis at the end of the film from how it's been heard prior to that. And that was Walter's idea to do that. He had a different take of the actor reading that line. He put it in, and it became a major plot point. It's what kind of solves the mystery in a way. And so that wasn't Coppola, that was Walter. And that just shows, how anti-auteur theory my movie is really, and Walter's existence is, the auteur theory being the director is the sole author of the movie. And, in some cases, that is closer to the truth than others, obviously, like with Hitchcock. But Hitchcock also was not really a writer, and so he collaborated with a bunch of people who would never say that he was the author of those movies. So Coppola, Walter always says that Coppola is the opposite of Hitchcock. He's, very, I don't know about selfless, but doesn't, have this whole thing about I have the movie in my head before we even get on set. He is much more collaborative and welcoming of other people's ideas. So that's why Walter was given so much leeway to make his own impact on films like The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, and the first two Godfathers. Actually, the third Godfather too, but he co-edited. But that came much later, and also it's not as good. But we don't have to get into that.
Okay. So for the record, I like the third Godfather film better than the
oh my goodness!
I'm probably 1% minority in the world.
That's great. Yeah.
So
very unique perspective.
Right. So my favorite Walter moment is a bit cliched, but it is the scene from The Godfather. I want to say it is Godfather 1. This is, of course, the scene of the horse head on the civet and put on the bed.
Oh, yeah.
When I first saw the scene, I don't think I really thought much about it, though it did, like with everybody else, leave a very, very deep impression on me. And many, many years later, when I read, of course, Michael Ondaatje's book, which is basically his conversations with Walter Murch, Walter spoke eloquently about, the days leading up to the day in which he cut this scene and mixed this scene. So what I remember, and you let me know if my facts are correct, is so the situation is that Coppola is not in town, and the producers are very unhappy with the music of Nino Rota, who of course is the composer of the very famous Godfather theme. So the producers are unhappy with his work on the film. In particular, they're unhappy with his work on this particular scene. So the original track that Nino had composed for the scene was probably a very light version of the Godfather theme. And it was, I think, designed as a counterpoint to the horrific visual, which is the scene itself. And Walter is figuring out what, he can do with it. And that is when, Walter's childhood sort of comes into play. So to put this in context, when Walter was a young boy, he used to play around a lot with audio tapes, putting multiple tracks one over the other,
yes,
or
right.
Playing them in the reverse and stuff like that. So Walter starts to play around with this track, and what he eventually does is he layers multiple versions of the track that Nino has composed, but at different points in time, right? So the layer 1 is playing, and then when it reaches a halfway mark, layer 2 is playing, and then so on and so forth. So the resultant music is this really, really eerie sort of a sound, music that sort of builds up to this massive crescendo, right? Which of course ends with the character screaming. Is this close to correct? Do I have my facts right?
Yeah, that's pretty much. I think it's more that that he had this kind of like almost like eerie circus-esque cue. Music cue from Nino Rota, and it was not playing right, and so he kind of played it. He doubled it and tripled it and looped it so that it kind of played once, and then a few seconds in, another, it played again, and then it played again. So it's all these different layers of the same song that just makes it sound like this nightmarish cacophony of sound, which is totally fitting to the scene because it's just this, as you said, legendary, horrifying moment that comes very early in the movie too, and has been parodied a bunch of times on The Simpsons and everything else. But that was another huge impact that Walter had. That scene would play very differently without his contribution.
You also had this other scene from Apocalypse Now, which I think is one of your favorites, and you speak about it a lot in the film, isn't it?
Yeah. So, as I said, it's in the first third of the movie, but the movie's it's like 2.5 hours long. So,
yeah.
So it's not quite at the beginning, but they were shooting in the Philippines. They had these helicopters that they were borrowing from the Filipino government, and I think the Philippines was in a war, or there was a civil war at the time, and so they would take the helicopters back from Coppola and the crew, and then they would, and so the shooting would be delayed, and it's just this, huge, very intricately orchestrated sequence of war. It's a battle where the helicopters are coming in and shooting and dropping bombs, and the Vietnamese are shooting back at them, and all the while Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, which is probably his most famous piece of music, plays. And so it's just this unforgettable, iconic scene. Robert Duvall, who plays Captain Kilgore, he is, I think it's captain. He might be lieutenant. I don't remember, colonel. But no, he's having a blast. He's having a ball, like as if it's like a game or a sport. And really, it's just this, as Walter says, the audience is supposed to be excited but horrified during that scene. And, then later, or right around there, Duvall also has the famous line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And napalm being one of the, weapons that the U.S. was using on Vietnam. So it's just the other interesting thing about that, and one of the main contributions that Walter had was, because he did the sound design for the entire film, he said that at first they used all of the sounds that you'd be hearing in the battle, just every last layer, hundreds of layers of sound effects, explosions, helicopters, waves crashing, gunfire. And he said it sounded like just noise. It was just a mess. And he said, let's scale this back. Let's just have, the absolute essential, if we're seeing fire, or gunfire, let's hear the gunfire. All the while, Ride of the Valkyries is going to be playing. And then it ended up being only a few tracks, and sound designers sometimes, when I was working in advertising and trailers, trailers now are so sound design heavy. There's so much emphasis being put on sound effects and not enough on music, in my opinion. But with the sound effects, you can have hundreds of layers now in Adobe Premiere Pro or your whatever software you're using. So that was very bold of him and confident, to just say, we really don't need all this. We just need a few, just a handful. And the scene still plays like a very overwhelming sensory overload, but it would be much, much more overwhelming in a bad way if Walter didn't get his hands on it.
Right. And I think, when we talk about Apocalypse Now, there are so many elements, but I think early on, at least one that I read about the most and one that I remember is also the opening sequence.
Yes.
Right? Like the Doors number. This is the end. Choice of the song, I think the few seconds before the bombing begins, the setting up of the landscape and all of that. It just has a very, I was thinking about it when you said eerie but exciting sort of a thing. It had the same impact.
Oh, yeah. And that was really Walter's idea, to have the opening be multiple images superimposed over each other. All these different dissolves, which is just this editing transition where you essentially crossfade two different images. And so for him, this is not just two images. This is, dozens that are layered upon one over the other, so that on the left side of the screen, you're seeing Martin Sheen's face upside down. On the right side, you're seeing fire, whole Vietnamese forest being napalmed. And then you're seeing like ancient statues, kind of religious icon imagery. And apparently, this is the 70s where they were still editing on film. Digital didn't come around until the 90s. And Walter, by the way, was the first Oscar winner in the editing category for a film edited digitally, The English Patient, which was edited on Avid. But so in the 70s, he was working with this equipment that was not really conducive to doing all these different effects. Now you can just bring them into your computer. Anyone with the software on their laptop can see what it will look like. But for Walter, he had to basically imagine what it was going to look like. Think about the timing of and the length of each shot. And apparently he had this like access to early video monitors that Coppola had. And so he was able to use those to see how it would look, to see what it would look like. But it was still very rudimentary by today's standards. And it required a lot of imagination, just kind of closing your eyes and thinking, okay, this is what it's going to look like when it plays on the big screen.
Right. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
Fascinating. This hair raising
Yeah.
stuff.
Oh yeah. And of course the use of the Doors, The End, that song.
Yeah.
Jim Morrison had already been dead for several years. But Coppola actually knew Jim Morrison. They went to UCLA together. And I don't think they were close friends or anything, but they were, I think Morrison was a film major. And so that really was a huge homage to this former classmate of his. And the fact that you hear it both in the beginning, which is, of course, an ironic use of you're hearing the end in the beginning, but also in the end of the film, so that it has this kind of circular structure. And it's also just this epic song, really long, that has like multiple movements, multiple parts, and just one of the great moments in classic rock.
Yeah, and now cinematic history as well, isn't it? You spoke about The English Patient, and my sense is also that Walter really thrives in a partnership, isn't it? I think his partnership with Coppola was very deep, very intense. Of course, one of the earliest partnerships in his career. And then, of course, Anthony Minghella's partnership. I think they did many films together. Right. The English Patient, to me, I had seen The English Patient before. And then I saw the film again after I read The Conversations, which is the interview he did with Michael, which eventually became the book. And then I saw the film with a completely new lens. Right? Like, for example, I didn't make anything out of the opening scene of the film, where there is this Middle Eastern medicine man sort of walking in with this huge stick filled with like hundreds of small bottles of medicines, and how it's sort of clinging against each other, and there is a sound that comes. And Walter, I think, talks about that in the book, and how we sort of recreated that sound. And then it was a completely different film for me overall. Right? What are your favorite partnerships of Walter? Where do you think he really thrives?
Well, I think the Minghella one is, it's not my favorite, but it's definitely an underrated one, especially The Talented Mr. Ripley. Which is a completely different movie from The English Patient and from Cold Mountain, for that matter. It's really this Hitchcockian thriller.
Or from Breaking and Entering.
Oh yeah, and Breaking and Entering, right? Which is also very underseen, underrated film. But Walter did not have anything to do with that one. But no.
So sorry. Yeah.
So Ripley, I think, has a lot to offer, and Walter talks about how it's kind of related to The Conversation in that it's all from one person's point of view, one single, very flawed anti-hero protagonist's point of view. You never see anything, or you never hear anything that Harry Call or Tom Ripley don't hear or don't see. So then he also talks about The Apostle, which is one of my favorite movies, this independent film by Robert Duvall. Murch has edited so many different movies that have Robert Duvall in them. And Duvall wrote, directed, and starred in the film. And he didn't ask Walter to edit it, probably because Walter was busy with The English Patient or whatever he was working on at the time. But he had a very long cut of the film and realized it was too long. So he gave Murch The Apostle and said, "Can you figure out how to whittle this down a little bit?" And Walter ended up cutting 20 minutes out of the movie, and that's the version that we have today. And I have no doubt that it was probably a better version, than the original. But yeah, so I would say without a doubt my favorite collaboration is with Coppola, just because those four films, Godfather, Godfather 2, The Conversation, and Apocalypse Now, are all near and dear to my heart, and just all benefit from Walter's contribution to them. Now, The Godfather and The Godfather 2, he did not edit. He didn't even do really the sound design for the first one. He was, I think he's credited as post-production consultant, but he had a tremendous impact on especially, one of the most important scenes, the assassination in the restaurant. And so I go into that in great detail in the film, putting these train sound effects, elevated trains that are getting louder and louder as we're building up to the moment when he pulls the trigger.
That's interesting. And you dwell a lot on this particular scene in your film, isn't it? Of course, I learned a lot about this scene after I saw your film, which of course had Walter's commentary. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about it? Because this is my favorite part of your film, actually, where you dissect this scene endlessly.
Yeah. So Michael in The Godfather is determined to assassinate, one of his rivals, Sollozzo, as well as a police officer who has punched him and is also totally corrupt and involved with all the crime that's going on. And so they're at this restaurant, and he's got a gun that's taped in the bathroom for him to grab, because of course at the beginning they search him, they make sure that he doesn't have a gun on him. He goes to the bathroom, he grabs the gun, he comes back, and he was told to come out blasting, to come out shooting right from the bathroom, but he decides he's going to take a different approach. He sits down, and there's a tremendous amount of Italian in that scene, and there are no subtitles. We hear the Italian, but it's not really that important what they're saying. We see what's really important is what we're seeing in the character, in Al Pacino's eyes, in the character of Michael Corleone's eyes. He is kind of just like looking up and down and to left and right, just waiting for the perfect moment. And the camera is slowly pushing in. Gordon Willis, the director of photography, is just, really forebodingly dollying into Michael's face. And on the soundtrack, Walter had this idea to put these elevated train sounds on so that the audience could hear them getting louder and louder as we're pushing into Michael. And then as soon as he rises and pulls the trigger, they stop. And so it's basically, not really realistic. And we never even see the elevated trains. But of course, he grew up near that area, and so he knew that there were elevated trains in the area. But it's much more about just a kind of a very creative, artistic, abstract expression of sound design and of what's going on in his brain. And he also says this is a homage to my favorite composer, Bernard Herrmann, who scored lots of the best Hitchcock films, as well as Taxi Driver and Citizen Kane. And in Psycho, his most famous and most widely parodied score, the shower scene, has these shrieking violins, and that elevated train sound, while it's not music, it's a sound effect, but it has that kind of screeching quality that mirrors the shrieking violins in the shower scene in Psycho. So a lot going on there.
Yeah. It gets me to thinking. Now, I spoke to you about that opening scene in The English Patient, and the scene that you just described in Godfather 2. I've seen probably like 15 times in my life, and then I saw your film, and I had not, in my mind, registered that this sound, and like you rightly said, they don't really show the elevated trains in the scene. So I had not really registered that this is the sound. Right? There is the sound of the train, and it sort of goes up, and then it sort of stops, when Michael is allowed to pull the trigger. It makes me wonder, a lot of a fantastic editor's work is almost designed to not be noticed, isn't it? It's by design supposed to be in the background and then sort of elevate the overall cinematic experience.
Yes, that's something that I talk about with my students a lot. That editing is this very weird art form where it's the only one that you're not really supposed to be noticing. If you are thinking about it, then that's bad. That's showing that the story, the emotion, and the characters are not as attention grabbing as whatever your cuts are that are happening. And when you have bad editing, then it's really noticeable. And so you have, you can be taking, even people in the audience who don't know anything about editing or have never edited anything before would see like, what was that? That's kind of a sloppy cut, whatever that was. And so the Psycho shower scene is what I use as an example of where you can get away with it, where you can get away with editing that is not invisible, but that is really calling attention to itself. And it was such a brilliant move on Hitchcock and Saul Bass, his storyboard artist, title designer, and who claims to have directed that scene, although I think that might be apocryphal. But the whole idea of this is a huge plot point. It's a huge moment in the movie where the star, Janet Leigh, is getting killed. And it happens in the first third of the movie, and it's totally unexpected. So those quick cuts, there's a whole documentary about that, about just the shower scene, 7852, which I highly recommend. And Walter's interviewed in that film too, where they just break down the scene and what went into it, what comes before it, what comes after, what the cultural impact of it was, what the historical significance of it was. And the editing, George Tomasini also, of course, was the editor. And so those three guys collaborating together got away with it. They got away with this like super fast, flashy, stylized editing approach because it's such a scary, shocking moment. And I think a lot of people in 1960, when it first came out, didn't even notice that there were all these cuts because they were so terrified. And so that is just, that is a moment of genius in film history. Right. So, but for the most part, if it's just a dialogue scene or almost any other kind of scene, you really have to be careful with how you're editing. And that's why the best editing, all the categories in the Oscars are kind of ridiculous because it's all subjective. And, especially in acting, how can you compare one performance in one genre to another? But anyway, in editing, even people who work in the film industry who are voting, members of the Academy, they're not thinking about the editing when they're watching these movies. Even the editors aren't. Yes. If a movie is good, you are not going to be paying attention to that. You are going to be paying attention to the themes, the story, the characters, the substance, the emotions. So it's like, that's why so often the film that wins Best Editing is also Best Picture, because it's just like, well, I guess, it was a really good movie, so it probably had the best editing too. But, an editor often is only as good as the material that they're given, and if Walter Murch was given terrible material, there's only so much that he could do. I'm sure he would still do something interesting with it, but so a lot of it's kind of, a chicken and egg situation where is it about the editor, about the material, or both? So a lot going on there.
You know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of his theory about reverse 20 questions. Do you recall
what is that?
So I think, I want to say it's part of the book Conversations, but I'm not sure. Walter could have said it somewhere else. He says that the making of a film is like playing 20 questions, but in reverse. So basically, 20 questions is, you know the answer, and there are 4 people in the room, and the other 4 people are trying to guess what you know. So the answer is a constant. Right. But in reverse 20 questions, you are asking a question, and so let's say there are the 3 of us playing the game. You're asked the question, is it circular in shape? And then you say yes. Then the person next to you, he might have thought of something in the room which is square. But now that you said circle, he's sort of changing what he originally was thinking of the thing into something that is also circular, right? And then, let's say the person asks him the question, is it white? And he says no, then that affects the next person's answer. So Walter says that cinema is something like this, where every person is sort of adding a completely different dimension to it, which changes your own perspective of what it is.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I'm rereading the Conversations right now, so I don't think I've gotten to that part yet. But God, it just shows that after putting hundreds of hours into this movie, there's still theories of his that I have either forgotten or have never heard. So there's just so much there. But so a movie I've heard, I don't think Walter said this, but someone said that the best movies don't answer questions, they ask them. So I think that's kind of related.
Yeah, that's beautiful. John, before we sort of close, what are some of your other inspirations in cinema?
Well, definitely.
So that we can have another podcast discussing those.
Definitely Hitchcock is my favorite filmmaker. Vertigo is my favorite movie. And Bernard Herrmann, as I mentioned, my favorite composer. Yeah, and I'm a massive Beatle maniac. I love the Beatles so much, and I love John Lennon in particular. And as far as other filmmakers, Stanley Kubrick, Werner Herzog, Mike Leigh, John Cassavetes, Kurosawa, Ozu, and Mizoguchi. A lot of those great Japanese filmmakers from who were peaking in the 50s or 60s.
Right. You're fairly old school.
Yes, yeah, so I'm older. Yes, it's true. Most of my favorite filmmakers are not alive anymore. That's
true. It's true for me as well. But is Walter still working?
Yes. So he just made a really interesting documentary. He co-edited it, co-wrote it. It was directed by an Iranian director named Taghi Amirani, and it's called Coup 53. And it's about the Iranian coup that overthrew the Mossadegh, I believe, and put in the Shah Reza Pahlavi, and which led to, who was just like a fascist dictator who was there for 20 years, and then that led to the Iranian Revolution. And so that movie uncovers, what we kind of know already, but really goes into detail about how involved the U.S. and England especially were in what was really just a massive mistake and just an intervention that should have never happened. So it's a mystery, and it's an action film, and it's a documentary, and Ralph Fiennes is in it. He and Walter are old friends from The English Patient, and he is reenacting an interview that was done with one of the people who I don't think is alive anymore. So they have the transcript, but they just wanted to recreate it, bring it to life through an actor. But all the other interviews are real people, real archival footage. So, and that's kind of similar to what I did with Rubber Soul with these interviews with Playboy and Rolling Stone. I had an actor who playing John Lennon bring them to life because there was some audio, but no video was ever taken of them. But anyway, so Coup 53 is available to watch online. You just have to buy a ticket for your local, that would go to your local theater, and then I think they split the profits. So it's also kind of a self-released venture because they played it at, they premiered at the Telluride Film Festival. They had a lot of interest, but then, people, for whatever reason, distributors would just kind of drop the ball or go dark, go silent for at the last minute. And then the reviews started coming in, and they're really, really good. And it's a very worthy movie. It shows there's a lot going on in it. And I think that, it just shows Walter's really still, he's alive and kicking. He's got, and I'm sure, and he's not done. He's working on a book right now. And so, I love that I think that he could still be working for maybe another decade or two.
I absolutely hope so. And but I got to say, I thought Dave, you would mention David Lean at some point, given you're an editor and
yes,
a filmmaker.
No, David Lean that's a great example of an editor turned director. I especially like Brief Encounter and his Dickens adaptations from the 40s, Great Expectations and Oliver Twist. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia is fantastic, of course, but also kind of problematic, and I think a little bit too long. But there's another director who was an editor turned director, Hal Ashby, who I really, really love. And he was part of the 70s new wave that Walter and George Lucas and Spielberg and Scorsese and Coppola were all part of. And Ashby made Being There with Peter Sellers. That's probably my favorite. But he also made Harold and Maude and Coming Home, lots of different films that Bound for Glory about Woody Guthrie that are really enduring, that still people look to. And there's a really good documentary about him too, called Hal, came out I think 2 years ago. But he was an example of he started out in editing and kind of continued doing it even as he directed, just because you never stop. If you're an editor turned director, then you're always thinking with an editor's mind. And when I'm on set, I just do a few takes because I know exactly what I need, what I want, and when I've got it, we move on. And so, that I think it really benefits to have that kind of eye as a director.
I'm told producers love editors who want to direct.
I guess so.
So that means less wastage.
That makes sense.
But I can't end without asking you, what do you think? I know you did say you're not the biggest fan of Lawrence of Arabia, but what about that thing that goes around where people say it's the greatest cut ever? The blowing of the matchstick to the mirage, to the setting.
Yeah, so I should say it's not that I'm not a fan. I really do like it. I just think it's just not one of my personal favorites. But so that cut, right. Ann Coates was the editor, and she had an amazing career, really interesting. She worked on some Steven Soderbergh films and Unfaithful, which is a great thriller, Diane Lane and Richard Gere. So back in Lawrence of Arabia, she made this incredible cut, basically a graphic match from Peter O'Toole blowing the match to the blazing sun on the desert. Now, someone asked her, 30 years later, like, what were you thinking when you made that cut? And she said, how am I supposed to know? I cut it 30 years ago. But it is unforgettable.
Yeah. Wait, John, we usually end the episode by asking, our guest what he or she is listening to, watching, reading these days. Anything that's streaming, a podcast or a book that's currently keeping you occupied that you want to recommend to the audience?
Well, I am usually pretty late to the game. I'm kind of a late adapter. Walter is a very early adapter to like technology and lots of things like that. And I just kind of I was one of the last people I knew to join Facebook. So I am, very cautious with new stuff that I watch. I'm pretty selective because I love to revisit stuff. So right now I'm revisiting my favorite TV show of all time, The Wire, which is about the city of Baltimore and all of its flaws and crime and politics. And David Simon was the creator of it, and he, has gone on to make lots of different shows, Treme, The Deuce, and he started out by making Homicide: Life on the Street, which is also pretty good, but nothing compares to The Wire. The Wire is just basically a literary masterpiece in television form. So I highly recommend that, even though it ended 13 years ago. I just, as we were talking about earlier, most of my favorite filmmakers are dead. I see nothing wrong with spending most of my time with the past, with history. I love history. So, but yeah, newer stuff, like I love Better Call Saul is a great show. As far as films go, I just finally saw Minari, which is terrific. Yeah. And just a great portrait of a family, really. So yeah, great writing, great acting, everything about it, really. It's like an instant classic.
Yes.
And then, Bo Burnham is a great comedian who made this special on Netflix called Inside, and it was shot, edited, scored, written, and starring him. And it's funny, and it's also kind of depressing, but in a way that gives a lot of insight into what the last year and a half has been all about. And it's really, really creative. So that's really great. And then Promising Young Woman is one of my favorite films of the last few years. I think that it really captures the zeitgeist and shows how awful men can be, and is just actually like very cinematic and very entertaining and really, really smart filmmaking.
Right. It's also the uncanny coincidence. I just Promising Young Woman is in my playlist, but I just started watching The Wire. Started rewatching The Wire last week. The first episode. So same feelings. You spoke about how Walter is an early tech adopter, and I thought we can end the episode with a bit of trivia. Recently I was reading somewhere that Walter is the only editor to have received the Academy Award nominations for films that were over the years edited on 4 different platforms, basically 4 different generations of editing platforms, right? I think started off with Moviola and then Avid and FCP, and I'm sure I'm missing something else. Is this trivia even right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if all 4, but he's definitely used all 4, like Final Cut, Avid, Adobe Premiere, and then film. And film is what he was on for the longest. But yeah, I mean, to be editing on film is, and I actually did it just a little bit when I was in high school. It's a totally different experience. It's much more physical. It's much more tactile, and it's harder. It's more cumbersome, and if you lose something or if you make a bad cut, then it takes time to fix it, and you have to make sure you're making copies and everything. And when you're in the digital world, then it is a totally different experience. Everything is kind of self-contained and compact and readily accessible at your fingertips. You can make a cut so easily and undo a cut so easily and move things around and locate, search for things, find things. But in the afterword of In the Blink of an Eye about the digital era, he kind of makes a warning that, there are a lot of, obviously this is incredible and we should all be really thankful that we have access to this technology, which we didn't have for the first 100 years of cinema. But make sure you're still taking some time to think, to step back and think about what you're doing and do those things that when you were working with film would just happen organically, that would you would always have that time. You would always need, just be given that time to think, to be just by nature of the beast, by the nature of how long it took. And then with digital, things can move so much faster. You move so quickly that you can sometimes not be, you might not be making the best version of what it could be. And that's really what editing is all about. Every single frame, there's 1,000 different things you can do, at least. And then he also talks about collaboration, how, now with digital, it is so easy to work alone. And that can be a really good thing. Like with Bo Burnham inside, he is a multi-talented person. And, it's a pretty satisfying tour de force. But there are other, I'm sure for every inside, there's like thousands of other projects out there that would have benefited from more than one person working on them. So now that we can do everything with our own cell phones and computers, we should never lose sight of how important it is to work with others and how much you benefit from that. And that's what Walter Murch's career is all about. Coppola would not be Coppola without Walter Murch. Lucas would not be Lucas without Walter Murch, and Minghella wouldn't, and all these other things. So also I should plug Walter Murch's solo directorial effort. His one feature film was Return to Oz. And that is a film that I think is criminally underrated. Very weird, very, very scary, and not anything like The Wizard of Oz, which I also love, but is
of which he was a huge fan
and it's not a musical, and it's much more realistic and gritty, but a really, really great movie. Just be careful showing it to children, maybe under 9 or 10.
Beautiful. John, that was as beautiful as your tribute to Walter. And I need to thank you for making a film that's easily available to everyone. So we're going to share the link, with your permission, the video link on the show notes of this podcast. And also to Rubber Soul, that's another film that I would love to.
Yeah, so the trailer is on Vimeo, so you can watch the trailer, and then one day the film will be available.
Wonderful. Good luck to all your films, and hope to catch up with you sometime soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Kartik.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Kartik. That's Kartik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys. Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Paisa Vesta, Anupam talks to Siddharth Mehta, CEO and MD of FreeCharge. They discuss buy now, pay later, neobanks, and a whole lot more. On our new show, The Longest Constitution, hosted by Priya Mirza, we look at what it actually has to say about things we come across in our daily lives. In our first episode, we touch upon adultery laws and why they treat men and women differently. Say No to Drama with Chetna kicks off with an episode on dating apps. Along with Aisha and Kunal, we celebrated Cyrus's birthday with a bunch of listener questions, birthday traditions, and a whole lot more. On the note, journalist Kaveri Banzai discusses her new book, The Three Khans, and how they see their Muslim identity. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Siet Cred, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and CoinSwitch Coup. We really do appreciate the support.